Hey CW Bio, Mr. Kennedy here, and these are your Chapter 11 lecture notes on meiosis and why it's important for genetics. After this, we're going to have you watch part 2 of this Chapter 11 series, and we're going to learn about a guy by the name of Gregor Mendel. Before we get into that, let's talk meiosis. So, you've already learned the steps or phases of meiosis, so I don't want to spend a bunch of time walking you back through that. But I do want to spend some time reminding you about, well, why we have meiosis at all before we get into Gregor Mendel and genetics. So let's just revisit a few things, okay? When you think about your genetic material, well, in order for you to reproduce or to create a future generation of anything, whether we're talking about humans, cat, dog, fish, frog, you name it, genetic material has to be passed on from one generation to the next. We do that using our chromosomes, which basically is a collection of our genetic material, our DNA, organized into genes, right? So when you think about what's passed on from one generation to the next, there's lots of ways to refer to it. You could say we're passing DNA on from one generation to the next, and you wouldn't be wrong. You could also say we're passing on chromosomes, and you still wouldn't be wrong. And you could also say we're passing on genes, and you still wouldn't be wrong, right? So basically what we're trying to say here is you got to pass some stuff on to the future generation or you won't have a future generation no matter what you call it, okay? So these genes, these chromosomes, this DNA, well, it lives in the nucleus of your cell, and basically it has to get from there to a different cell that can be combined with a cell from somebody else so that you can get a future generation. Yay, that's a lot of stuff. So these genes, they're embedded along our chromosomes, and they're going to be our focus as we talk about meiosis and as we talk about Gregor Mendel. So here's a few things to, get you to remember genes and why we have meiosis. So remember these terms, diploid and haploid. I know I've given these to you in a past video. So I'm just going to remind you that in our body, we have diploid cells, we have haploid cells, okay? Now, if you remember these terms, then you'll probably remember that you can't reproduce or create a future generation with diploid cells, okay? In anything that is sexually reproducing, like a human, a cat, dog, fish, frog, whatever, you need to have, cells from two separate individuals that come together to make a, future generation. In terms of humans, our body cells, as we call them, are diploid, which means they have 46 total chromosomes in them. You can't take 46 chromosomes and body cells from two separate people, combine them, and end up with a future generation, an offspring that still only has 46 chromosomes. That doesn't work. So that's why we do meiosis. Meiosis is all about reducing the number of chromosomes in our cells by 1/2. Okay? That way, when you take two cells, one from two separate individuals, put them together, you can get the right number of chromosomes in the offspring. So remember, diploid cells, full set of your chromosomes, 46 if we're talking about people, not useful for sexual reproduction. They are useful for mitosis, okay? Making things like muscle and skin and bone and all that, but not making future generations. The cells we need for those future generations are these guys. They're the haploid cells, okay? They have half the genetic material than what you started with. So when you take two of those, you put them together, then you get the right amount of genetic material moving forward, okay? This idea of taking haploid cells from two separate individuals and combining them supports a, theory from Gregor Mendel, a man who you will learn more about here in just a little bit, who came to the conclusion that for everything that you see in the mirror, everything that you are, you've inherited two factors or alleles for each of those things from your parents, okay? So, you get one gene from mom and one gene from dad. They come together and they give you what you see in the mirror. It takes the combination of those two genes working together to give you a trait. If you only inherit one of those genes, well, then you're not going to show that trait. Make sense? That's Mendel's idea of two factors are required, or two alleles are required for every trait. And we get those two alleles after meiosis has produced haploid cells in 2 separate individuals, and then those 2 cells meet, fertilization occurs, future generation, here we go. Okay, you should remember this, right? These are some haploid and diploid numbers from different creatures that we've talked about in the past: garden peas, apples, like chimpanzees and people. Okay, now the next thing I really want to stress and remind you of is what a homologous chromosome is. Okay, so homologous chromosomes are the matched set of chromosomes that you get from your parents, right? So one homologous chromosome comes from mom and it matches up with a homologous chromosome that comes from dad. Okay, the genes on those chromosomes are, well, positioned right across from each other to make these chromosomes homologous. So as a rule, to have a homologous chromosomes, you have to have genes for the exact same trait in the exact same place. But remember, okay, those genes don't have to be identical. If they're identical, or not, really doesn't matter. So we'll just refer to variants of those genes as an allele. Okay, that's where the term allele comes from. And you might remember me using this example. So we've got 2 homologous chromosomes here from a common garden pea. And as you look close at it, you're comparing like, wow, this has like flowers on it. That has flowers on it. But where are the flowers? And then here's a pea pod and here's a pea pod. But look at it, like this one's inflated and this one's like bumpy and constricted. And here's a tall plant. Here's a short plant. So you might be looking at that going, how are those genes for the same traits in the same place? Well, like they are, because this isn't a gene about being tall versus being short. It's a height gene, right? So you got to inherit one gene for height from one parent, one gene for height from the other parent, and together those 2 genes work together to tell you how tall you're going to be. That's what we mean by homologous chromosomes and matched genes in the exact same place for the, traits that we have. And it takes the expression of both of those genes to make you tall or not tall. Okay, so at the end of the day, this is why we have to have meiosis. When cells divide by mitosis, the new cells that you produce have exactly the same number and kind of chromosomes as the original cell. If mitosis was the only way of reproducing, look, each pea plant parent, which has 14 chromosomes, would produce gametes, sex cells, that have 14 chromosomes, and your baby pea plants would have 28 chromosomes. In another generation, they'd have 56, and then they'd have like 112, and you'd have way too many chromosomes. So you gotta have meiotic division to produce these gametes, which allows for sexual reproduction. Okay, that's at the end of the day why we gotta have it. So there must be another form of cell division that allows offspring to have the same number of chromosomes as their parents, and that is what meiosis is all about. Meiosis takes 46 chromosomes in a human cell, reduces it by 1/2, and at the end of the day, take 2 cells, put them together, you're going to get the right number. Okay? All right. So here it is in words, right? Meiosis consists of 2 separate divisions known as meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. In meiosis 1, we begin with the diploid cell. By the end of meiosis 2, there are 4 haploid cells, and those haploid cells are our sperm and egg if we're talking about an animal, or if we're talking about a plant, it's a pollen and egg, but basically they're the gametes, right? And when sperm meets egg or pollen meets egg, that's when fertilization occurs, and all those chromosomes come together and they make the future generation through sexual reproduction, all right? So this pattern of reproduction involving the production of subsequent fusion of haploid sex cells is what sexual reproduction is all about. Hugely important for the animal world, for the plant world, because this is the only way we get genetic variation that ensures that we don't look exactly like our parents. All right, ladies and gents, I'm Mr. Kennedy. This is your intro into genetics from chapter 11 of your book that answers the very simple question of, why do we have to have meiosis? Now you know. I'll see you next time.